Welcome back, everyone. It's your host, Costa G. My guest today is Brian Moriarty. Brian works for Morningstar Manager Research as an Associate Director of Fixed Income Strategies. He is originally from the Chicago area and attended Michigan State University, where he studied political science. We had a great conversation, which included how he got into financial services from a political science undergrad. So stay tuned. Hey, Brian, thanks for being here today, sitting down and recording a podcast with us. I know we talked a little bit earlier about what you do, just kind of off camera or off recording rather. But for our listeners, can you just kind of walk us through your career path, basically from undergrad at MSU and to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to be here. Thank you. So I graduated from Michigan State in 2008 with a degree in political science. And at the time, my dream was to become a foreign service officer, which is a career official in the State Department. They're implementing, U.S. foreign policy overseas. And I dreamed of living in an embassy. I always saw myself living overseas. But becoming a foreign service officer involves an exam, which is a multi-stage process, written exam, oral interviews, background checks, security clearances. And the whole process from start to finish, can take a year or more. And if you fail out at any stage, you have to wait a year before you can take it again. And I think the ultimate pass rate is something like 2% of people ultimately matriculate into being a foreign service officer. So it's difficult. And I took it twice, and I made it to varying stages each time, but never made it all the way. And that ate up, a couple of years of my post-college career. At the same time, there was 2008 looming over everything. So I moved back to Illinois from college on August 18th, 2008. I'll always remember the day for some reason. But Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy about a month later, almost exactly. And that set the tone for the next few years, right? So there was a recession. This was also the heyday of the Tea Party. So government hiring overall was just very constrained. It was a pretty difficult time to break into public service, at least the areas that I wanted to work in. And after a while, I started expanding my job search to other government entities, the FBI, the NSA, and so on. I went back to school at DePaul University, where I got a degree in Islamic world studies. I was thinking about what I could do to differentiate myself. At the time, I got a job as a research assistant within my degree program, which was a great experience. But kind of ultimately, I was faced with three options. One was to go for my PhD and pursue a career in academia. The second was to move to Washington, D.C. and try to get a job on Capitol Hill. And the third was to give up and go look for a job in the private sector. And honestly, I couldn't afford the first two options, so this choice was easy. And I started looking. And Morningstar came recommended from a family member as a company that valued people with backgrounds like mine. So I applied for an entry-level job. I was 26 at the time, or 25, 26, and I was hired. And I joined Morningstar in January of 2013.
Awesome. So you are originally from Chicago, correct?
Yeah, I am, yeah. The
Okay.
south suburbs, but I was born in Chicago. I don't want to. Some people get angry when there's Chicago versus the suburbs, so I
Yeah.
grew up on the south side. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about what made MSU attractive to you as like a place to study undergrad.
Yeah. It was a couple of different factors. So one was the fact that I wanted to go to college not knowing anybody. I wanted this to be the experience of going away and not having the sort of high school support group that I had at the time. And that was actually a little bit difficult because my senior class in high school was around 700 people. And so any Illinois school that I went to, there's a chance that I was going to see a lot of people from high school. So I knew just based on that I wanted to go out of state. At the same time, I had some family connections in Michigan. I had some cousins and aunts and uncles who lived outside of Ann Arbor. We had briefly lived in Michigan when I was a very small child. So I was more familiar with Michigan than I was with a lot of other areas or a lot of other Midwestern states. And I wanted the big the big college experience. I wanted a big conference. I wanted to go to football games every Saturday and basketball games in the winter and stuff like that. So that ultimately, it's just sort of narrowed it down to a few choices. And when we visited Michigan State, I just fell in love with the campus. honestly is what ultimately sold it for me. The river running through it and everything was just beautiful. So once I was on campus, that was sort of that.
Awesome. I think a lot of MSU students would agree with you with the campus being one of the main selling points of the school. So I want to kind of go back to your first job with Morningstar. So you get that first job, and I want to talk about, like, coming from a non-finance sort of educational background. Did you find that there was like a steep learning curve? And if there was, how did you kind of work to like overcome that?
Yeah, there definitely was. So when I first joined, my job was in client service, answering the phones when our software clients called, who were specifically usually financial advisors, calling in with questions or problems. And at the time, the first few weeks on the phone, I didn't know what expense ratio was. I mean, you learn it pretty quickly. They teach you, but didn't know what expense ratio was, didn't know what a basis point was, all of this sorts of stuff. So it was a huge learning curve. Um, but I guess the only way that you overcome anything like that is you just have to immerse yourself in it, right? So I read every recommended book, everything on Morningstar.com. I was probably the most extreme consumer of Morningstar's own content for the first year or 2 years of my time there. I've watched every movie and documentary you can think of, even the bad ones, just to get a sense. And the idea here is um, not that I'm gonna like learn or pick up everything for the first time I will read a book or watch a movie or anything like that, but you need to sort of learn the language that's being used and the terms that are common to the industry and so on. Because one lesson that I had thankfully learned prior to joining Morningstar was that most people can kind of learn anything. Which I don't know if that's a radical statement or not, but I guess what I mean is that like lack of domain specific knowledge doesn't mean that somebody is stupid. It just means that they haven't been exposed to it or haven't taken an interest in it at that point in their life or up until that point. Um, so I knew how to learn, so to speak, right? Which is immerse yourself in the language to learn the terms that are being used, and then to just break things down into kind of basic component parts and learn how they work together, right? Which is in our industry would be, all right, you've got the asset managers, you've got the investors, the financial advisors, like there's a whole system there, a plumbing. And so how does that work together, right? And you can figure that out. It's not easy. It takes a lot of time and it took a lot of effort on my part. But I knew it was doable joining before I joined Morningstar. And so that it was pretty empowering once I decided that that was what I wanted to actually do and learn more about.
Absolutely. So I want to kind of going off of that, what made you sort of stick with the finance industry, maybe Morningstar in particular, or just a role coming out of that non-traditional background in finance?
Yeah. The first thing was that I discovered that I actually really liked it. So before joining Morningstar, I think like maybe a lot of people who don't have much exposure to the finance industry, I had a kind of a dim view of the industry, to be honest. I thought it was stereotypical Wall Street bankers and predatory behavior and so on. And part of that was because of 2008, right? That was the seminal moment in my most of my life until the coronavirus crisis, to be honest. And so that really it anchored a lot of my viewpoints for a number of years. But Morningstar is nothing like that, and the focus is on helping the end investor, empowering investors, kind of cutting through a lot of the bad behavior and so on. And that really spoke to me, coming from my perspective, where I wanted to work in public service of some fashion. That the mission of Morningstar, I was very attracted to, and so once my perception was corrected, so to speak, right, because it was my perception that was wrong, not the industry that was wrong. At that time, I'm not sure if another institution, another company could have done that, could have changed my mind, so to speak. I think it was very much right place, right time in terms of me being where I was in my career, and then Morningstar being what Morningstar is. Now I have a much, I think, wider and more open view, obviously, of the industry. And at the same time, I found it really intellectually stimulating. Markets are always different, always changing, and it's more than just just numbers. It involves people, right? So human behavior, decision making. There's a lot of ambiguity in the markets, in how people make decisions and so on. And all of the things that made me love politics and history and policy and all that stuff was right here in finance. And so once I saw that and realized that it was not what I had thought, I was hooked.
Awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of people have that sort of closed-minded view just because of what they
Yep.
see maybe on the media or something like that. The industry's kind of painted a certain way. So it's
Yep.
awesome that you got the opportunity to kind of broaden your view.
Yeah. And I'm very thankful for that. Is because before I joined Morningstar, my own sort of financial life or approach to it was, I think like most Americans, right? I didn't really know what I was doing. I just kind of saved. I didn't really invest or anything like that. And so learning what the industry can do for people, or what investing and proper financial advice can do, is extremely empowering. That's been one of the most powerful forces in my life since I joined Morningstar. And so I will always be glad and thankful that I had my eyes opened.
Yeah, really cool. So I want to dig a little bit more into your role, or obviously your multiple roles with Morningstar Research Services. So you have, I guess, what I would call like a more of a non-traditional role in wealth
Mhm.
management compared to maybe what a lot of people think of when they think of like wealth management. They're thinking of the guy that sits down with, John and Jane Smith and is running through their financial plan and how much can they spend this month, how much do they need to save, what are they invested in. So can you talk a little bit more about what you do now and how it kind of differs from that traditional role?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a manager research analyst. Another term with that for that would be a fund analyst. Manager research is the evaluation of portfolio managers, the people who are running the investments that go into those investment accounts. So I'm evaluating their backgrounds, their experience, investment philosophy, and then the skill in executing that philosophy, because often one of the things you learn is that there can be a disconnect between the two. There often is a disconnect between the two. So this involves interviewing the managers, digging through their portfolios to understand how and why they performed the way that they did, and ultimately trying to determine if there is real skill there or not. This was actually Morningstar's second line of business, its first being aggregating mutual fund data. So this job of fund analyst, originally called fund analyst, now called manager research analyst, has an extremely sort of storied history at Morningstar, and so it's a pretty interesting place to work. The it's it and just to put it in a bit more perspective, it's the same job that a lot of investment teams are doing at, for example, endowments, college endowments, university or hospital endowments, pension funds, consultants, OCIOs, big RIAs that have a centralized investment team. We're all doing roughly the same job, and it's called manager research because the vehicle doesn't really matter, whether it's an open-end fund or a VC, private credit, and so on. The broad goals and skill set of the job are the same, although obviously there are some differences when it comes to the vehicle to vehicle, but the basics are applicable. And where it fits into the industry, anywhere people need to make an allocation decision with their investments, right? So what core bond strategy an advisor should use in her models, or which emerging markets equity fund, a retail investor who has 2 or 3 dozen options in her 401k, like what should she pick? These decisions are difficult, and it's our job to provide clarity and actionable opinions around those types of decisions, ultimately to weed out, you know, the investments, in my case, mostly mutual funds and separate accounts, some ETFs, to weed out the ones that we don't think will outperform, and then highlight the ones that we do think will outperform over the long term.
So one question that I like to ask a lot of our guests is, what are some things that you like to read to stay up on either the markets or other developments in financial services? Being that you're in sort of, like I said, that non-traditional role, are there specialized sort of newsletters or pamphlets or anything like that that you try to stay up on?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's all over the place, or a number of different sources. So for kind of timely news, I think Bloomberg is one of the best ones in the industry. For I hesitate, but I'll do it anyways. It's just that Morningstar.com is honestly a wonderful place for stuff like this, because we have so many people producing content of all sorts and from all different angles, that I check Morningstar.com every morning, and there's often something interesting that I didn't know somebody else was working on, and from our equity team or from our personal finance team. And so there's always new stuff that I can learn from on Morningstar.com. Other industry sites would be something like a CityWire. I think they do a good job of getting interesting and relevant and timely info out there. When it comes to market specific stuff, I tend to find sources, whether it's an individual or a firm, that is quite good at one or two things, and then go to them for that answer. So for example, I might go to one specific either bank or investment management company or something like that for high yield bond information, and then another one for mortgage information, and so on. Because the better the data is and the better the commentary, typically those places or those organizations tend to differentiate themselves in terms of the quality of the data and the quality of the information they're talking about, and the quality of the information they're sharing with investors, excuse me. And it's I don't like the idea of kind of a one-stop shop when it comes to very detailed and very pertinent market information, just because in my job, if there's a mistake, or if I'm going to one place only for the advice, like talk about sort of echo chamber, so to speak, in markets, that's exactly the wrong thing to do, because a market is multiple people. So I don't like one source for all my information.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think a lot of our listeners can take that even outside of your specialized role, like, going to a lot of different sources for different news and maybe different opinions on what's going to happen in the next, predictions about the markets or anything like that. So
Yeah, the market is an aggregation of these opinions, and so you need to be surveying multiple opinions to get any sort of idea. And over time, maybe you learn, all right, this person or this organization is very good at one type of prediction or writing or whatever, and less good at another. And you just start continually refining your sources.
absolutely. So just two kind of last couple questions here, and then I'll kind of turn it over to you to maybe give us your thoughts on the industry or anything like that. But so since you've joined Morningstar Research Services, you've moved up quite a few times. I actually kind of looked at your LinkedIn before the interview. So I want to ask, like, what are some things that you've done in your career that you can kind of point to, and you would kind of give it as advice to younger generations to be like, if you do these things, you're going to be good in terms of moving up throughout an organization or throughout the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things. The first that jumps out to me, and this is not, I'm not the only person who has given this advice. I know, I think it's been given on a couple of other podcasts or people in the industry, but it is something that I learned in my own experiences, and that is find something that nobody else wants to do. There's always going to be a job that everybody else on your team is reluctant to do, or they try to hand off to somebody else, or nobody knows how to do. That's the job that you should be asking for and putting your time into, because the difficult stuff, the stuff that nobody else wants to do, and then you come in and figure it out or solve it or turn it into a much less painful requirement or job, that is a hugely powerful thing for any organization or any team. So find this stuff, ask your boss, like, what's the thing you wish you didn't have to do, or what's going to save you the most time if I can take it off your plate, stuff like that. Find the hardest part of anybody's job and do that thing. So I'll give you a real example for what I did when I first joined Morningstar. Is that in Morningstar Office, which is our tool for financial advisors. We also have a second tool called Direct, which is more for institutions. But Morningstar Office has a tool inside of it called the investment planning tool. And this is now, I'm dating myself because this is now 7 years ago, almost 8 years ago. And I know that things have changed since then in our tools. But this investment planning tool was this massive Monte Carlo simulator. And it was not just put in the investments and here's the sort of expected outcomes and range of outcomes, but it was everything that anybody could ever think of in terms of planning for their financial future. So down payments, kids, RMDs, 529 plans, expected monthly expenses and all this stuff. And it was extremely detailed. It was a massive, massive tool. But it was so detailed that nobody, and the questions we got on it were so limited that whenever a question did come up, nobody knew how to answer it. Nobody had any experience with the tool. Excuse me. And so everybody hated getting these questions around investment planning. And so that was the one that I picked, and I said, all right, I'll take that on. I'll be the investment planning tool expert on our team. I will spend my free time tinkering with it and understanding how it works, talking with the developers, understanding the actual logic behind all of this stuff. And it took a lot of work, but it ultimately resulted in a living document on our team that was an explanation of every stage in the process. And it made answering those calls and questions they went from being painful to being not a big deal, because me, along with some of the people that helped me, were able to figure it out. So stuff like that. At the same time, my second piece of advice would be you need to say yes to things until it's time to say no. And so what I mean is that you should be, every opportunity that comes your way, say yes to it, get the experience, make the connection, grow your network, expose yourself to different jobs, different opportunities, different working environments, and so on, different projects. But ultimately, there's a point in time where you can cross the threshold and you're overextending yourself, you're getting burned out, and so on. And so I like to think of it as, expose yourself to just enough, 99%, and then stop and say no. And you have to say, okay, now I need time to focus on what's on my plate, sort of consolidate, do a little bit of growing and soul searching, and reflecting on what I liked or didn't like about all of these things that I just said yes to. And then you sort of winnow it down and refine it into experiences and takeaways. And all right, I really like these two things, so now I'm going to go after those two things. And then you start saying yes again. And this is I think a skill that it takes a little bit of practice. It's almost for sure that if you're going to overextend or burn yourself out, but you need to learn to recognize that pretty quickly and then pull back a bit and then start over again. And so just continuing to sort of say yes and expand, and then stop it, reflect, grow, and move on. And it's kind of a cycle that I think once you do it a few times, you get the hang of it. But it's extremely powerful skill to learn earlier in your career.
Yeah, that's almost like counterintuitive to, I think, a lot of our listeners would think, is that they need to come in as, the intern or the entry level guy and just grind away, grind away, grind away. And it's almost like, yeah, that's good, but then also you need to be able to control yourself and kind of say no to certain things. So I think that's really good advice.
Yep.
Just to wrap up, I wanted to kind of turn it over to you. I know we talked a lot about a lot of different things. But was there any like last pieces of advice or anything that you can kind of take away from your career that would benefit younger advisors or people looking to get into the space?
Sure. So first thing is, again, not unique to me, and that's life doesn't go in a straight line. Your careers don't go in a straight line, and I think maybe a perfect example of that, to a large degree. And so knowing that in advance, and again, this is not unique to me, but knowing in advance that your career isn't always going to go the way you want it to go, and preparing yourself for that, just mentally, it can be pretty empowering to know, all right, you need to be prepared that this is going to go off the rails in some fashion or not go the way you want it to go. And that's okay. Because whatever happens, you're going to learn from it, and it will add to your experiences, and you will ultimately become either a better person or a better professional because of it, even if at the time it's painful. The second thing would be, and this is, I guess, a little bit in tension with what I just said, and that is, be clear about what you want. Say it out loud. So if you want a specific job at a specific company, tell your boss, hey, I know I'm 6 weeks or 6 months into this job here, but this other job over here, I really like, or I think I would really like it, and I want exposure to that, or that's the job I want in 3 years or whatever. Say that. Tell your boss that. And um, don't be passive when it comes to your career, I guess is my point. Being active doesn't always mean knowing what you want, right? You can be learning and exploring at the same time as you are saying, I want to learn this, I want to learn that, I want to try that job. Your boss isn't always going to know what you want if you don't say it out loud. And I just feel like, just to tie back to my experiences, I knew after 6 months at Morningstar that I wanted to join the manager research team. And I just started telling every check-in, every 6 months or every year, I was telling whoever my boss was at the time that this is what I wanted to do. And so when I applied for the job, my intentions were well known around the team and the company, and I had already made some connections to that team. So the transition was much easier than it being a surprise to anybody else. And just people knowing what your goals are, like suddenly I'm going to think, oh, Costa wants to do this. I'm going to, bring up this idea that I wouldn't have thought of him otherwise if he hadn't told me or said it in a meeting 3 months ago or whatever. So say this stuff out loud, I guess, is my my bottom line takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brian, I just wanted to thank you again for coming in. I think this was a great interview, a lot of valuable advice, and maybe exposure to a career that not a lot of our listeners would be familiar with outside of the traditional roles in wealth management. So, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. Thank you.
If you liked what you just heard, please like, comment, and share. This is Vincent Pacillo, producer of the MSUwma podcast. MSUwma, or Michigan State University Wealth Management Association, is a student organization part of the Eli Broad College of Business located in East Lansing, Michigan. Our mission is to inspire and educate the next generation of financial planners. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please check out our channel on all platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcast. And check out our social media at MSUwma and MSUwma.com.